The moment you explain yourself, you've already lost ground, not because explanation is weak in itself, but because of what it signals in the invisible courtroom where all social interaction is judged. Explanation says, I am on trial. It says, you are entitled to my reasons. It says, your approval is the final authority. Most people never notice this shift, but everyone feels it, especially the ones pushing you. Think about how often this happens in ordinary life. A colleague asks you to take on extra work that doesn't belong to you. A friend wants a favor that costs you time, energy, or dignity. A family member makes a demand wrapped in guilt. Your body reacts before your mind does. A subtle tightening in the chest. A spike of alertness. Cortisol, the ancient signal that something is being taken, and almost automatically you begin assembling your defense. You speak faster. You add context. You soften your tone. You explain your schedule, your exhaustion, your intentions. You offer proof that you are reasonable, good, fair, not selfish. What you don't realize is that this performance isn't designed to communicate facts. It's designed to reduce threat. You are trying to convince the other person not to punish you, emotionally, socially, or morally, for refusing. That is the invisible error almost everyone commits. They believe the conflict is about the request. It isn't. The conflict is about frame. About who is justifying themselves to whom, about who occupies the role of judge and who accepts the role of defendant without ever being asked. Watch how this plays out. When you explain your no, the other person doesn't usually stop. They counter. They adjust. They negotiate your explanation as if it were a weak legal argument. But it won't take long. But I really need you. But last time you didn't mind. Your reasons become raw material for pressure. The more sincerely you explain, the more surface area you give them to push against. This is why people who explain themselves constantly are perceived as pliable, even when they're competent. Not because they lack value, but because they signal uncertainty about their own authority. They behave as if their boundaries require external validation to exist. Now contrast this with a different kind of person. You've met them, even if you couldn't articulate why they felt different. When they say no, there is no apology in the air, no urgency, no defensive energy. The refusal lands cleanly, almost quietly, and the conversation simply adjusts. People may not like the outcome, but they respect the position. They don't argue much. Sometimes they don't argue at all. What's happening there isn't confidence theater. It's something colder and more structural. That person is not playing the same psychological game. They are not asking to be understood. They are not seeking absolution. They are not attempting to manage the other person's emotions. They are operating from a premise most people never install. My internal decision does not require narration. This is deeply uncomfortable for those who rely on social leverage. Because explanation is the handle they grab. Remove the handle and there's nothing to pull. Notice how early this conditioning starts. As a child, no is rarely accepted on its own. You are trained to justify it, to give a reason that adults can approve or override. Over time, this teaches a quiet lesson. Your preferences are provisional until validated by authority. Fast forward into adulthood, and the authority figure changes shape. Boss, partner, group consensus. But the posture remains. So when you say no without explanation, it feels wrong at first. Not morally wrong, somatically wrong. Your nervous system expects backlash. It expects escalation. It expects punishment. That expectation is the residue of years spent being rewarded for compliance and clarity and corrected for opacity. Here's the part people miss. Respect does not come from being understood. It comes from being legible and immovable. Legibility is saying no clearly. Immovability is not justifying it. The combination is rare because it requires tolerating something most people avoid at all costs. The other person's unresolved discomfort, their confusion, their disappointment, their unprocessed emotion. When you explain yourself, you're trying to help them metabolize that discomfort. When you don't, you leave it with them. And that is the boundary. This doesn't make you cruel. It makes you sovereign. Cruelty is imposed harm. Sovereignty is the refusal to manage what isn't yours. Pay attention to how often explanation is disguised as kindness. I just don't want them to think badly of me. I don't want to seem difficult. I want them to understand where I'm coming from. Underneath all of that is fear of misinterpretation, fear of being cast as selfish, cold, uncooperative. But misinterpretation is not lethal. Chronic self-betrayal is. The people who gain respect are not those who win every interaction. They are the ones whose internal lines are clear enough that others adapt to them, not because they dominate, but because they don't leak. When you say no without explaining, something subtle happens in the other person's mind. They are forced to make a decision. Either they accept your boundary and recalibrate, or they reveal themselves by pushing harder. In both cases, you gain information, and information is power. Explanation, by contrast, blurs this signal. It keeps everything polite, ambiguous, unresolved. It preserves harmony at the cost of clarity. And over time, people learn that your no is negotiable, emotional, conditional. They don't consciously think this. They feel it. This is why the shift feels dangerous. You are stepping out of a familiar role, the reasonable one, the accommodating one, the explainer. And roles once abandoned don't applaud you on the way out. But here is the quiet truth. The people who lose respect for you when you stop explaining never respected you in the first place. They respected your usefulness, your accessibility, your willingness to absorb pressure. When that disappears, so does their comfort. Silence after a no is not emptiness. It's a mirror. And many people don't like what they see reflected back when there's no narrative to hide behind. You don't need to announce this shift. You don't need to dramatize it. You simply stop overperforming coherence for other people's benefit. You let your decisions exist without a story attached. That's when the balance changes. Not loudly, not immediately, but irreversibly. Most people think power shows up in what you say next. It doesn't. It shows up in what you don't rush to fill. After a clean no, the room changes temperature. There's often a pause, sometimes literal, sometimes just perceptual, where the other person recalibrates. This is the moment that exposes the structure of the relationship. Not because anyone is confessing, but because habits surface when scripts fail. You can see it in small things. The slight laugh meant to soften tension. The follow-up question disguised as curiosity. The casual why, delivered as if it were neutral, when it's anything but. These aren't requests for information. They are attempts to re-enter the frame you just exited. Most people panic here. They mistake the pause for danger. They rush back in with explanations, tone management, reassurance. They think they're being reasonable. What they're actually doing is repairing a power imbalance that no longer exists, except in their own nervous system. This is where inversion begins. The person who asks why after your no is implicitly positioning themselves as auditor. They're signaling that your decision requires inspection. If you answer, you accept the premise. If you don't, something interesting happens. The burden flips. Silence after a boundary is not passive. It is an active refusal to participate in a hierarchy you didn't agree to. Watch how quickly roles reverse when you don't take the bait. The question hangs there, unsupported. The other person feels exposed, not because you attacked them, but because their expectation of control wasn't met. Many respond by justifying their request instead. Others back off entirely. A few escalate, revealing entitlement they usually keep masked. This is why non-reaction is so destabilizing. It removes the familiar choreography. There's no villain, no debate, no moral drama, just a decision that stands. People often misunderstand this and think it's about dominance. It isn't. Dominance seeks reaction. Sovereignty does not. Dominance needs the other person to submit. Sovereignty doesn't require agreement at all. Consider a simple exchange. Can you do this for me? No. Pause. Oh, is everything okay? Yes. That's it. No edge, no explanation, no counterattack. The conversation either moves on or reveals something it was hiding. Notice what didn't happen. You didn't defend your character. You didn't justify your priorities. You didn't manage their feelings. You didn't teach them how to treat you. You simply behaved as if your decision was already valid. This is what people mean when they say, energy matters more than words, though they rarely understand why. The words are ordinary. The energy is final. The reason this works is neurological as much as social. When you explain yourself under pressure, your body is broadcasting uncertainty. Microsignals, pace of speech, vocal inflection, posture, betray the internal negotiation happening in real time. The other person senses this and pushes, often without conscious intent. When you don't explain, your physiology stays settled. There's no chase response, no appeasement. That calm registers as authority because authority, at its core, is the absence of internal conflict made visible. This is also why over-politeness backfires. Excessive warmth during refusal reads as fear dressed up as courtesy. It invites persuasion. A neutral tone, on the other hand, gives nothing to grab. Now, an important distinction. This is not about being rigid or unresponsive. It's about timing and ownership. There are moments when explanation is appropriate, chosen freely, not extracted under pressure. Explanation offered later, on your terms, feels entirely different. It reads as generosity, not concession. The mistake is explaining in the moment to relieve tension. That impulse is old. It's the social animal trying to restore equilibrium. But the equilibrium it restores is usually one where you are slightly smaller than you need to be. Here's where the inversion sharpens. When you don't explain, the other person is forced to confront their own assumptions. If they assumed access to you, that assumption is now visible. If they assumed priority, it's now challenged. If they assumed compliance, it's now disproven. You haven't accused them of anything. You've simply declined to participate in the fantasy. This is why silence and brevity are often more ethical than elaborate justifications. Justifications manipulate perception. They steer how the other person interprets your refusal. Silence lets reality land without decoration. There's a quiet confidence in allowing someone else to be disappointed without rushing to fix it, not as punishment, as respect for their autonomy. Adults are allowed to feel friction without being rescued from it. Most social games persist because someone keeps cushioning the impact. When you stop doing that, a few outcomes become consistent. People with healthy boundaries adjust quickly. They may not like your answer, but they recalibrate their expectations. People who rely on leverage escalate. They push harder, guilt more overtly, dramatize the stakes. This is not a failure of the method. It's its diagnostic function. Escalation is information. And information, when observed without reactivity, dissolves confusion. You see who respects limits and who only respects resistance. You see who relates horizontally and who needs hierarchy to feel safe. The power here is not in winning exchanges. It's in no longer being entangled in them. At a certain point, you realize that many conversations were never conversations at all. They were negotiations you didn't consent to, trials you didn't know you were standing in, contracts you didn't read but kept honoring. Saying no without explanation voids those contracts retroactively, not with force, with absence. And absence, when consistent, rewires how people approach you. They come cleaner. They ask less invasively. They accept quicker, or they drift away. All outcomes are clarifying. This is why the shift feels lonely at first. You're removing a social lubricant that kept things superficially smooth. But what replaces it is something heavier and more stable. Coherence between your internal decisions and your external behavior. That coherence is what people label as presence, gravitas, or self-respect. Even though they rarely analyze it, they just respond to it. You don't need to announce boundaries when your behavior makes them obvious. You don't need to threaten consequences when your consistency already implies them. You don't need to explain yourself when you trust your own judgment enough to let it stand alone. The inversion is complete when you stop asking internally, "Is this allowed?" and start operating from "This is decided." From there, respect is not negotiated. It's inferred. There is a version of you that learned early to explain in order to survive. Not metaphorically, literally. The child who sensed tension in a room before words were spoken. The one who learned that clarity could reduce punishment, that reasons could soften authority, that being understandable was safer than being opaque. That child grew up competent, articulate, perceptive, and tired. Because explanation, once installed as a survival reflex, never turns itself off. So when you refuse without explaining, it doesn't just disrupt social patterns, it disturbs an identity. It touches the shadow, the part of you that equates being questioned with being threatened, being disliked with being unsafe. This is why the practice feels heavier than it looks. On the surface, it's just fewer words. Underneath, it's a confrontation with an internal myth. If I don't justify myself, I will lose love, safety, belonging. That myth persists even when evidence contradicts it. Even when you've seen people who don't explain themselves move through the world with ease, even when you know, rationally, that adults are allowed to decide without permission, knowledge doesn't dissolve conditioning. Exposure does. Each time you say no and resist the urge to narrate, you're not performing a tactic. You're integrating a shadow, the part of you that can disappoint others and remain intact. This is where dark psychology caricatures get it wrong. They treat silence as a weapon, detachment as superiority, boundaries as leverage. That's adolescent power. It still needs an audience. Adult sovereignty is quieter. It doesn't need to win. It doesn't need to be seen as strong. It just refuses to fracture internally to maintain external harmony. Notice how accusations change when you stop explaining. You're cold. You've changed. You're difficult now. These aren't observations. They're grief responses. The other person is reacting to the loss of access, not to your character. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Access was never a right. It was a habit. When you stop explaining, you force a reckoning. Not dramatic, not explicit, but structural. Relationships reorganize around what's real instead of what was assumed. Some tighten, some thin, some dissolve. This is not collateral damage, it's filtration. What remains is cleaner. This is also where guilt surfaces in its most deceptive form. Not the loud, moralizing guilt, the quiet one. The one that whispers, "You could have handled that better. You didn't have to be so abrupt." A good person would have clarified. But look closely. That voice rarely asks whether the explanation would have been true. It asks whether it would have been soothing. So ask yourself a colder question. Was I being honest, or was I being anesthetic? Anesthesia feels kind in the moment. It numbs friction. But over time, it creates dependence. People learn that you will absorb discomfort for them, that you will smooth edges, that you will translate your boundaries into something they can swallow. Sovereignty interrupts that pattern, not by becoming harsh, by becoming exact. Exactness is saying what is true and stopping there. No padding, no apology for existing, no performance of virtue. This exactness changes your relationship with desire as well. When you stop explaining refusals, your yeses become heavier. They carry weight because they are no longer diluted by obligation. People feel the difference. A yes from someone who could easily say no lands differently. It's trusted. This is how respect actually accumulates. Not through assertiveness theater, through consistency between inner alignment and outer expression. The final integration is this. You stop using language to manage identity. Most explanation is identity maintenance. I'm not lazy, I'm busy. I'm not selfish, I'm overwhelmed. I'm not rejecting you, I just can't right now. These may be true, but notice how they center perception over reality. When you release the need to be seen a certain way, language simplifies. It becomes descriptive instead of defensive, functional instead of performative. And with that simplification comes a strange calm. Conversations shorten. Negotiations evaporate. You find yourself less entangled in other people's emotional processing, not because you care less, because you respect the boundary between what is yours to carry and what isn't. This is the difference between control and maturity. Control tries to shape outcomes. Maturity accepts fallout. A sovereign person understands that every boundary has a cost. They simply choose to pay it up front instead of in installments of resentment. You don't need to announce this evolution. In fact, announcing it would undermine it. You let it reveal itself through repetition, through the absence of over-explanation, through the quiet finality of decisions that don't tremble. Eventually, something shifts internally. The reflex to justify weakens. The pause after no stops feeling dangerous. The other person's disappointment no longer triggers self-interrogation. You begin to experience a new identity, not louder, not harder, but denser. You are no longer porous. And paradoxically, this density creates safety. For you, for others. Because when people know where you stand, they don't have to test as much. They don't have to probe. They don't have to push to find the line. The line is already there. This is the adult posture. Not reactive, not defensive, not withholding, simply self-contained. If this resonates, not as advice but as recognition, if something in you is tired of being legible at the expense of being whole, then you already know the experiment. The next time no appears, let it stand alone. And watch what rearranges itself around you.